if Fulton Sheen was working on this book and it just wasn't the right time. Because when you read the content of the book, it's like he's talking today. Well, yeah, it was 50 years ago he was saying these things, he was prophetic, it's come true. It's like more true today than it was back then. I'm Father Dave Tomaszicki, a priest of the Archdiocese of Detroit. I've been a priest for 8 years, love being a priest. And I wrote a book, but not really. Fulton Sheen wrote the book, I just put it together. So late in his life, Fulton Sheen saw a lot of demonic activity, both individually with specific instances and generally with the culture at large. And he saw that a lot of people were studying the culture, but kind of too close to it, like, oh, the American culture, oh, this culture over here. And he thought we had to step back to take the grander view and realize that there's something much bigger going on, that the demonic was at work. Now, why didn't Fulton Sheen finish this book? Because he said he was going to write it. In 1974, he said he was going to write it. Why didn't he finish this book? That's a good question. In the 70s, he was traveling around a whole lot, giving retreats all over the world, and he was writing very little. There's only 2 books of his that came out in the 70s. I think there's about 15 books of his that came out in the 40s. So it was a different time. He was ill. He spent a lot of time in the hospital late in the 70s. And then I do wonder, and I don't know this for a fact, I do wonder if maybe he just felt called by God to not finish this book. He had said things, his words were out there in some way, shape, or form, but maybe he sensed from God that that wasn't quite the time for this book. There were many sources used. It's like 84 or 87 different primary sources. So I had to dig deep. The book is entirely made up of Sheen's words through manuscripts, typescripts, different archives, audio archives that I had transcribed, articles in diocesan paper, some parts of books here and there, but it's all Sheen's work. So I was engaged with a publisher, and they said many people come to write a book and they have one idea. Oh, I have this idea for a book. An idea is one chapter. You need like 10 ideas, with a central focus, and that makes up a book. So listening to Fulton Sheen recordings, I found like 5 talks on the demonic. I'm like, oh, there's 5 books. That's half the book. Done. And I listened to those talks, and it's like, well, those are each really the same talk. Okay, I'm down to 1 chapter. Where do I go from here? So I had to do a ton of digging. There were times where I'd lay in bed like there's not enough for a book, what do I do? So as I dug, I found articles in the Rochester diocesan paper, and he was the bishop there from 1966 to 1969. There's some very good articles starting about 1969 on the demonic in that, and some of those articles make up entire chapters in the book. There's a plethora in his talks. His talks in the early 70s, he was traveling around the country giving retreats, or more accurately, he was traveling around the country and the world giving a retreat. And that retreat was about 12 to 15 talks. He has an entire talk on the demonic, an entire talk on fighting the demonic with the holy hour, an entire talk on the blood of Christ, which is one of the weapons of the demonic. So I would go through these talks, I'd find 4 or 5 talks on the same subject, and I'd have them transcribed. Sometimes I would transcribe them. It'd take me about 6 hours to transcribe a half-hour talk. I would find one talk that I liked the most. I would go through the flow, and I'd say, okay, theme number 1, theme number 2, theme number 20, whatever, I'd lay it out. I would lay them all out on my bedroom floor, like 4 or 5 talks, and on a Friday, which is my day off, I would go through and I'd splice them together to create a chapter. So when I was doing that, a chapter, if I was moving very quickly, a chapter would take like a month to compile. It was a ton of work. By the end of the day, I was just brain dead. If you republish every one of those talks, well, they're basically the same, so there's a lot of repetition. But if you only publish one of those talks, well, you're missing some gems in the other ones. So I thought it best to go through and really splice these together. Because, with a talk, you can't go back and redo it so much. So Sheen, he fumbles every now and then with his words. Well, as an author, Sheen was very particular. He really wanted things a certain way. So with these talks, lay them all out on my bedroom floor and say, oh, this is a great line here. Ooh, this is a good line. And sometimes like, oh, this half a sentence is the great introduction for this over here. So that was a ton of work. About half the book is from those talks that I had transcribed and whatnot. A big chunk of the book is from articles from the Rochester diocesan paper. And then kind of a smaller chunk of the book is from handwritten notes from Fulton Sheen himself. So yeah, the biggest challenge, well, there's 2 challenges that are tied for the biggest. I would say just finding the content. Like, where do you even look? I started out with like nothing. So I had read different biographies and things about Fulton Sheen, and at the end it says, oh, the archive's here, and take a look at this. And so I'd look into those things, I'd Google things. It was really hard to come up with certain things. You send an email, maybe you hear back, maybe you don't. It took me like 3 years to put the book together. Another challenge was copyright. 84 or 87 different primary sources, all with different copyright statuses. Like, where do you even go from there? So there are things in books that are public domain. There are things in books that are not public domain. You know, you can quote 2 words from a book, but can you quote 5 pages? What's the line? Well, the rule is 4 contiguous paragraphs. Not continuous, but contiguous. What does that mean? Lawyers argue about that. So it's trying to figure all that stuff out. And then once you figure out what is copyrighted, is a lot of work to get those permissions. But we got them all. Like everything, I didn't have to cut anything because of copyright. That's one of my fears. But we got it all. This is the purest form of the book. There were a few things where I thought, if we have to cut it, I can make up the material over here. It won't be as good, but we can do it. We never had to do that. We got it all. We got all the permissions. This is the book. It's all there. I wonder, and I'm not the only one who wonders this, but I do wonder if Fulton Sheen was working on this book and it just wasn't the right time. Because when you read the content of the book, it's like he's talking today. Well, yeah, it was 50 years ago he was saying these things. He was prophetic. It's come true. It's like more true today than it was back then. He talks about the signs of the demonic, the love of nudity, okay, the eroticism that is today compared to 50 years ago. Yeah. Violence, people marching in the streets. So there was a lot of that in the 60s and 70s, but it's different today. And even people, they try to change Christ. They try to do violence to Christ as opposed to changing their own hearts. And then schizophrenic mentality, which is really loss of identity, that's way more today. Fulton Sheen was bemoaning the loss of identity back in the 70s, and that's back when we knew that there were 2 genders. Today, it's exaggerated big time. And I see it's had a big impact on me just working on this. So the devil, you know, he's a tricky one. And the only defense is Jesus. That's the only defense. And I see people who are like, just be conservative and you won't fall into this. Just be liberal and you won't fall into that. And they almost seem to think like, oh, the devil has traps for the liberals, but he has no traps for us. It's like, no, he has traps for everyone. There is no like system, just do this and you're fine. No system. It's Jesus, the person of Jesus. So God unites, the devil divides. His nature is division. Now, it's not quite as simple as that's all it is, because the devil will unite you against God. But we have to stay united to God. That's the big thing. Have to stay united to God, and this is only through the cross. So yeah, this is a very tough subject, difficult, dangerous subject too. And I do worry about people getting the book like, oh, this is going to be cool. Oh, the demonic. You know, there's a real danger with over-fascination with the devil, which C.S. Lewis warns against. But there's another equal and opposite danger, which is like, hey, let's not even address it. So Fulton Sheen, he's addressing the demonic, but his eyes really are on Jesus. He has a way of just explaining the devil, like, you know, here's God, but here's the devil, but here's God. Like, he keeps going back to God. Even the chapters that are about the signs of the demonic, the second half of the chapter is usually like God working against that. You know, so he can't help himself but talk about Jesus and talk about God. And I hope that's where we go, because that's our only defense is Jesus. The book is now ready to ship. It's now ready to order. So please click on the link below. And with that link, there's photographs of Fulton Sheen. There's more about the book, more descriptions about the book. And I hope you buy it, and I hope you're edified by it. I do think it's a very edifying book and will help you in these crazy times.